When we were young, our first science teacher showed us illustrations of atoms as little colored balls called neutrons and protons surrounded by brightly glowing electrons moving in predictable orbits in assigned shells around the nucleus of the atom. In our young minds, actual atoms, if we could see them, would look just like that. Little colored balls with electrons whirling around them. Of course, you can't see an atom, and if you could, it would look absolutely nothing like the model. And yet the model helped us to understand atoms. Understand their behavior at least, something of their nature. And so the models provided the ground on which we could meet to talk about chemistry, physics. In fact, we would likely never have made much progress in our comprehension of science if we had not at the beginning oversimplified it just to get a toehold to initiate the climb up into a better understanding. Your elementary school and middle school science teachers were not liars. They were not simpletons. They were, however, trying to explain a very complex idea to you in a way that you had a chance at getting a good grasp of. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, the introduction was where they stopped. Some of you, even now, may be mildly irritated at the thought that I have just told you that you're wrong about what an atom looks like. I can only tell you that your mild irritation will only get worse over the next 40 minutes. Similarly, we began our religious education with stories about miracles. We made, if you grew up in the kind of church I did, you made models of the Ten Commandments out of modeling clay. We learned about the anthropomorphic images of the God who obviously defies description. But we always tended to imagine God in one form of human likeness or another. We created a God who feels what we feel, who understands us and yet somehow loves us. I have to credit my friend Michael Dowd for so clearly articulating the issue of personification. Our more ancient cousins tended to personify nature, making the wind, the ocean, the sky, the sun, the earth, ice, into gods who had names, had characters, and had peculiar appetites. Thinking of aspects of nature as persons was a natural first step in trying to get our minds around the experience of a universe that was inevitably capricious, unpredictable, and unreasoned. Our first introductions to the concepts of the divine other were quite naturally given to this same tendency towards personification. That's why this conference is interspersed with these short videos from the series Nature Speaks. Giving voice to the aspects of nature lets us feel both a bit of the primitive early religious personification of nature and at least a suggestion of a renewed sense that the God of the universe is still the God of the universe, or the universe is God somehow, those two holding hands. Still, while we must graciously allow everyone the freedom to believe and practice whatever they wish, as long as they do no harm to others, those of us who strive to embrace an evidence-based faith should open our minds to new ways of trying to articulate an understanding of the divine that is not anthropomorphic, that God is not a person. Bowing to the objective truth of sciences should not remove the existential experience of a sense of awe and wonder, or even marvel at the universe. Mystery, if we use it in a proper spiritual context, should never be used as a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card, that we don't know. We say that this business of religion is terribly important, but it's ultimately a mystery, and that's all that can be said about it. If you feel cheated when you hear that, you have good reason to feel cheated. Because if it's important, you've got to be able to say something about it. And yet we oftentimes use the word mystery to intersperse it with magic or superstition. We can eschew superstitious thinking, but we can still embrace the profundity of a real universe that defies comprehension and continually astonishes us to the core of our being. In one of our Sunday school series here, we did Neil deGrasse Tyson's Cosmos series, because I think theology that is divorced from science quickly becomes magic and superstition. That we have to be able to engage in what is our best approximation of the truth. Now, science has obviously changed. We started watching the previous Cosmos series, Carl Sagan's, and you realize that it had to be updated some, even though it was aired not that long ago, within recent memory. But the sciences are not a perfect theology, but one of the differences between the general practice of religion and the practice of science is religion will write a creed that must never change and cannot be varied from. Science will write a textbook that is planned to become obsolete within 2 years and has to be rewritten and updated. Presented with new truths, science changes. Western religions have resisted that. Now, one of the things I think that we find attractive about Eastern religions is the fact that presented with a changing worldview, Eastern religions seem to respond more readily to a quick change. The Dalai Lama, in one interview, asked about homosexual same-sex relationships, initially said this would be incompatible with Buddhism. And then a medical student talked to him about it for about 15 minutes, and he said, on second thought, it is incompatible with Buddhism to reject these love relationships. And you see that someone who represents an entire universe of understanding of the nature of humanity and their relationship with God can literally change on the spot. Western religious people often look at the religions of the East as if they were not religions, because they lack the theism, the supernatural theism of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And so we ipso facto discern that if you've got a heaven and a hell and a monotheistic theology, that you're superior to religions that lack that supernatural theism, or as in Hinduism's case, has dozens and dozens of characters of God, all of which are representing different aspects and experiences of life. Eastern religions were not captured by the push towards the attempts at monotheism seen in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but to be honest, the three great religions of the West were never very good at being monotheistic. And if you tried to take any kind of definition of Trinitarian views seriously, you're going to be doing more gymnastics than you're going to see coming out of anywhere in Brazil anytime soon. That it just is incomprehensible to try to say there's only one God and yet so many divine characters, even in Judaism and Islam. Any attempt at describing the Christian Trinity and then walk away feeling like you've just had a logical conversation is fated to fail. Much of the attraction in recent years to the Buddhist view of God is specifically because it's not specific. It lacks specificity. Now, Buddhists teach that all that is connected and the divine is united with the all. As Epimenides said, we all live and move and have our being in God. God is not a rock or a tree, and yet all rocks and trees are in God. God is not out there, but is both out there and in here. There are, of course, many forms of Buddhism, and some will talk more about the devas than others, the non-human spirits. But it's safe to understand such things as personifications of either our own emotions or our ideas, but not actual invisible floating spirits. The fact that Buddhists refrain from describing God does not mean that they do not believe in a divine presence. And Christians and Jews oftentimes have looked at Buddhism and declared it not a religion because it simply lacked its supernatural theism. But But Eastern religions, I think, have been more respectful of the notion of God by refusing to be too specific about it. In fact, a persuasive case can be made for laying the blame of most religious wars at the doorstep of monotheism. If you come up with a concrete view of how God must be, then I'm so right that if you disagree with me, you must be virtually lethally wrong and become subject to being destroyed. Most wars can best be understood by the old adage, follow the money. And in fact, there may have only been one war in all of human history, the war between the haves and the have-nots. Kings and presidents use high-sounding moral or religious reasons for going to war, but they're almost always lying. It's always about power, it's about real estate, it's about capital wealth. Even if the motivations of governments likely have little or nothing to do with actual religious beliefs, the hearts of believers are often left vulnerable to being recruited to crusades and wars in the name of a theology that is ultimately indefensible. Paul Tillich, the famous 20th century theologian, created a great deal of public controversy when he said, God does not exist. Now, he said it in a way to create public controversy and to get attention to the fact that he was asking people to reframe their understanding of God. But what he meant is that God, what Charlie was saying earlier, God is not a person, God is not in a place, and if you try to personify God in any way, then you're virtually denying God's ultimate existence. Tillich was probably what we now call a panentheist. Panentheism is the belief that the universe is God, but pantheism believes that the universe is God. Panentheism differentiates itself from that by saying that while God is in the sum of rocks and trees and stars and planets, that does not total God, and somehow there is something more. What that something more is increasingly difficult to articulate. As Tillich said, God is the ground of our being, although trying to turn that profound awareness into a person by attributing anthropomorphic emotions, will, intent, or even intervention into human history is bound to end up being wrong. That if you try to be too concrete about it, you will only be embarrassing yourself. In poetic terms, Hal Tussek, in an essay entitled Disparate Presence, speaks of meditating on a poem, a song, a leaf, a flower, sunlight on the wall, fully anticipating each to have an impact on how he thinks and feels and acts. He says, one might say that I treat these various objects before me as God, and I wouldn't disagree with that, but would hasten to clarify, I do not conceive a collective consciousness behind the particulars. There is no ensemble making up the singular whole. Something like what Charlie was saying about the wobble in a star in the sky must be caused by something, and the gravitational pull of the divine essence is somehow casting a shadow over us that is indescribable and beyond being quantified. In the hope of preserving credible, meaningful, and relevant faith in the 21st century, I think we have to stop trying to limit God to any religion. Stop trying to manipulate the divine into doing our bidding or punishing our enemies or rewarding our friends. Now, all of this I said in my chapter in my book, Progressive Faith and Practice, on Panentheism. But since publishing that book a couple of years ago, I've realized that there is some weakness to stopping there. Saying what I do believe is more difficult than saying what I don't believe. But if we could jump off from a verse in the epistles, 1 John 4:8, God is love. And for good measure, because Scripture is not nearly enough for a lot of us anymore, I always have to come back to a quote from the great Dane, Søren Kierkegaard. This is all that I have known for certain, that God is love. Even if I've been mistaken on this point or that, nevertheless, God is love. Now, in this church, we often use Ziggy Marley's song that we heard yesterday that announces, "Love is my religion." And the Beatles hit, "All you need is love." So that's my premise, that's my conclusion, that's my ultimate point. And yet you might think, why is that fat man still talking? But the fact that the poets, musicians, philosophers, and saints have been saying this for thousands of years makes it inescapable that understanding what that means is nearly impossible. I mean, it is not ultimately satisfying to just say that God is love. And it can't be simply reinterpreted as God is loving. Of course, much of the problem resides in the word itself. It's overworked. We love Adele's new album. We love scuba diving. And even when we say to another person, "I love you," we say it with such a big I and such a little you that it oftentimes doesn't make much sense. Even when you let go of believing that you have an imaginary friend who lives in the clouds, it's still difficult to give up on a notion of God as a person. A person who might favor Brazil over Argentina in the Summer Olympics, or the armies of the USA over the armies of ISIS. You would not get trapped in a theological argument over whether God prefers blue over green or Chinese food over Mexican food, but it's harder to give up on the idea that God as a loving entity somehow enters into human history. Now, Charlie kind of leaves us hanging in saying that God is the initiator of a Big Bang. Whatever initiated the Big Bang, let's say that was God. Whether it was a simple aspect of physics or the intent of some incomprehensible deity, but then leaves the universe alone, which is sort of the way Aristotle frames it, that God created the world but doesn't know we exist because we're just too imperfect to bother thinking about. And I'm watching too much political news this year. I understand that perspective. Much has been made over the implied theology that we see in sci-fi movies, especially in Star Wars, where the characters talk about the Force. In the very first movie, Obi-Wan Kenobi explains to Luke that the Force gives the Jedi his power. It's an energy field among all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together. Now, there's a dualism in that. There's a dark and a light side of the Force in Star Wars, a good and evil side, and nerds will burn the midnight oil debating whether George Lucas was influenced by Zoroastrianism or Taoism or Buddhism. It's an interesting thought, but of course Lucas is not capable of remaining consistent with whatever religious influences he may have tried to clone into his movies. The Force very quickly becomes approximately an energy drink that helps you with your lightsaber. And I can't fault Lucas for that. This is not an easy concept to talk about meaningfully. The words force or energy may have roles in what we ultimately mean when we think about God, thinking about God as love and not as a person. Especially not a person that would place a bet on the World Series. You know, you have to let go of personification to let yourself begin to feel what you're really after here. Albert Einstein was often referred to as having been an atheist, but he would never have described himself that way. It's just that what he did believe was so nuanced, so obscure, that to Christians in the earlier part of the 20th century, it sounded like atheism, but it isn't what he meant. He said, "We are in the position of a little child entering a huge library filled with books in many different languages. The child knows someone must have written the books. It does not know how. It does not understand the languages in which the books are written. The child dimly suspects a mysterious order in the arrangement of the books, but doesn't know what it is." That, it seems to me, is the attitude of even the most intelligent human being when they try to talk about God. We see a universe marvelously arranged and obeying certain laws, but we only dimly understand those laws. Our limited minds cannot grasp the mysterious force that moves the constellations. So Einstein concludes, there remains something subtle, intangible, and inexplicable. Veneration for this force beyond anything that we can comprehend, that is my religion. Not worship of that force, but veneration of that force. And that is vague and difficult to nail down, but that was Einstein's own words in trying to describe what was at the deepest level of his relationship to the universe. Now that is the point, though, when a Buddhist monk and an astrophysicist starts to sound an awful lot alike. There is a certain mysticism to that in the presence of massive specificity of scientific research. And yet there is a bit of awe, a bit of mystery, in which you step back and just say that there is a veneration of it. There is a feeling about it that defies simply putting facts down in a science textbook. Because you know, a physics book doesn't read like a phone book. It's not digit, 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 digit. There's a certain astonishment to the facts. Even when you watch these Nature Speaks videos, and, you know, they're very well done, but they're not made up. It's not fantasy. It's not a superstition. They are actual images of nature. If you can sit outside on a dark night and look up at the stars and feel nothing, that's your problem. That's not the problem of the universe. We are all connected to one another biologically, to the earth chemically, and to the rest of the universe atomically. That mystery, that connection, that force or energy we sometimes sense as awe or veneration, the great thou that seems to meet us at our deepest core, all of the world's religions are attempts at describing this, to codify it, to teach it. How do you explain to a child what this feeling is? So you turn to scripture, to rituals, to hymns, to art, to architecture. But can't we all admit that we never get it right? There's not one right hymn. There's not one right poem. There's not one right religion. Almost in exhaustion, prophets, saints, sages, and scientists and philosophers boil it down to trying to say that it is love. It is through my loving relationships with others that we encounter the divine. If anything exists of worship, surely it's that. If there is a sacrament left to the church, isn't it in loving relationships? Isn't love all the scripture we really need? And yet look at our society. How fractured we are. How unlikely it is that we'll ever join a church or join a bowling league for that matter. How difficult it is to hold a friendship together, to keep people united with each other. And yet if there is anything that we can know of God at all, it is in loving relationships. But everything about our life teaches us that human beings are expendable. The same way when I make coffee in the morning in my Keurig, and once coffee's been run through it once, it's completely worthless. You wonder sometimes if people are incapable of friendship, that they don't know any loyalty. Well, they do know loyalty. They are being loyal to themselves. They were friendly to you when you were useful to them. The moment you stop being useful to them, you're just like one of those Keurig cups that's already been used once. You get disposed of. Why is religion so mysterious to us? Because we have failed to embrace what it means to be in loving relationships. The Dalai Lama said, our only purpose in life is to love one another. And he added, because the Dalai Lama's this kind of guy, if you can't do that, try not to hurt anybody. Which is in a way to acknowledge that, yes, Yoda, there is a dark side to the Force. There is an opposite to loving. And the Zoroastrians may not have been entirely wrong in saying that the two sides of the force are of approximately equal strength. There is love that brings us together, that creates not only marriage, but, at my age, I think friendship is of a more sacramental nature than marriages that are oftentimes put together by sexuality, shared financial interest, and child rearing. But a friendship that has no shared financial interest, you're not raising any kids together, you're not investing in the same piece of real estate, but your love for each other is just that. Forgiveness, love. Isn't there something sacred in that has been lost by our ability to just discard, and to walk away from those relationships? There is darkness in us, available to us, in the form of narcissism, greed, self-righteousness, that pulls us apart, that depletes civilization of its meaning, destroys peace, alienates lovers, it makes community impossible. If you say that the church is going to die, churches are going to pass out of existence, I might yawn in reply to that. If I could believe that community was going to emerge somewhere else, I just don't see it. It will either survive in communities of faith, or I fear that it will not survive. Far too often, the religious impulses that should help us to find a spiritual path into loving connection with others has become the dark and dividing force that makes real spirituality nearly impossible. And I'll talk about this more tomorrow morning, and I hope you'll talk with me about it, because several of you who are here know me only through the internet, really. Thankful to those of you that make the trip regularly to be here for our conference. But if you go home and don't have a connection to a faith community, I think you're missing an important point. That somehow, apart from those mysterious connections and relationships, I'm not sure that anything you get from me on the internet really makes much sense. Bishop Spong has called for a new reformation, one that allows us to strip away the magic and superstition to reveal a kind of spirituality that is rooted in reality and not just in our imaginations. And I think that we are seeing it happen in some important ways. In our never-ending presidential campaign, we see nearly every candidate trying to polish their religious bona fides. Donald Trump actually went to church one Sunday, Presbyterian church, carried his family Bible to that event and to others, even though he still doesn't know how to say the names of the books of the New Testament, and is clearly a complete stranger to what goes on inside of a church. Attack ads have called out other candidates for pretending to be right-wing evangelicals, even though they never attend or support the churches that they claim. But for the first time in modern memory, we had a political candidate this year who claims no affiliation to an organized religion. We now know, through the emails leaked by WikiLeaks, that the Democratic Party was actually planning to use Bernie's lack of fervent religious affiliation against him, and it wouldn't have worked. This is a bizarre turn of events in human history. I've been saying for months that Bernie Sanders could be our first Jewish president. Hillary Clinton was going to break the glass ceiling to be the first woman president, but even if she had not won the nomination, Bernie Sanders could have been the first Jewish president. He was bar mitzvahed. He went to a Hebrew school. He even lived for a time in a kibbutz in Israel. But when asked about it, he said that he wasn't actually a member of any formal religion. He said, "I think everyone believes in God in their own ways." He continued, "To me, it means that all of us are connected. All of life is connected. We are all tied together." Which is theologically what I've been trying to say for years. The unique thing for me is that a popular presidential candidate can publicly say that he really doesn't practice religion, and the country was not shocked. The shock that we felt was that someone in the Democratic Party thought that they could use it against him, because nobody would buy into it anymore. Nobody here, anyway. There may be other people somewhere, but nobody here would. What he's saying is not offensive to us. It's not foreign to our ears. Truth be told, it's probably what most political candidates and figures already believe. The only difference is that my man Bernie was willing to say it. The facade of false ancient religions is being drawn away from our society. The echoes of ancient religious teachings, married to the mystery and wonder of modern science, lead us not to become atheists, but simply to acknowledge that while we believe in God, all we really know about God is our experience of awe and wonder and the love that mysteriously takes place among friends and families. And that the only path to knowing any more about God is to strengthen those love relationships rather than discarding human beings. This is both liberating and immensely challenging. Once freed from the constraints of ancient creeds and religious manipulation, our first impulse is not always to draw closer to one another in love, but to flee into more narcissistic endeavors. I think the church still has a lot of work to do. If we want to actually preserve any kind of faith community, any kind of tangible spirituality, and I hope we do, I hope I'm not alone in that. I may have been wrong about a lot of things through the years, but I'm not wrong about this. God is love, and the only way that we'll ever know anything about God is to get better at loving each other.
Amen. Amen.
Now,
you have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.